On 11th of May, 1938, in the drawing room of the American Embassy residence on Prince's Gate, London, Rose Kennedy adjusted her eldest daughter's white satin sash for the third time. The late afternoon light falls through tall windows dressed in ivory silk, casting long shadows across parquet floors that have been cleared and polished for photographs and practice curtsies. Outside, chauffeurs idle along the edge of Hyde Park, their engines a low murmur beneath the sounds of an empire preparing for evening entertainments. But inside the residence, the air is thick with hairspray, French perfume, and the particular tension of a family about to be judged. In one image now preserved in the Kennedy family collection at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, Rosemary stands slightly apart from her sisters Kathleen and Eunice, her smile perfect and practiced, her white gloves pulled just a little too tight across the wrist. Her diary from these years, pages that would later be examined by biographers seeking to understand the woman behind the family myth, records opera performances at Covent Garden, tea dances at Claridge's, dress fittings on Bond Street, and trips across Europe sliding toward war. It was a life arranged like a social curriculum, each event a lesson in becoming the kind of woman a Kennedy daughter was expected to be. Before departing for Buckingham Palace that evening, Rosemary copies out a carefully prepared statement in her neat, effortful hand, just as she had once copied a response for the Boston Globe describing her serious tastes and her Montessori training, words chosen by others, performed by her. A photographer adjusts his equipment and calls for stillness. Rosemary smooths her gloves one final time, ready to perform a perfect curtsy before the King and Queen of England. No one in that gilded room yet knows that this poised young woman, presented tonight as an ideal daughter of the American ambassador, a symbol of Catholic achievement and democratic grace, will be surgically silenced 3 years later, her brain deliberately damaged so that the family image may remain intact. On 13 September 1918, at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy labored through the night in a modest wooden frame house while the Spanish influenza pandemic raged through the streets outside. Boston was in crisis. Hospitals overflowed with flu patients, and medical personnel were stretched beyond capacity. The attending physician who had been scheduled to deliver Rose's third child was delayed. Some historical accounts suggest he was tending to other patients in an overwhelmed city, others that he simply arrived late, his priorities elsewhere. What happened in his absence would shape an entire life in ways no one in that bedroom could have predicted. A nurse remained with Rose through the long hours of labor, but she was unwilling, or perhaps untrained, to deliver the baby without a doctor present. According to family, biographers and later medical speculation based on Rose's own accounts and the testimony of relatives, the nurse instructed Rose to keep her legs together, to delay the birth until the physician arrived. More disturbingly, some accounts indicate that the nurse physically held the baby's head in the birth canal for as long as 2 hours, preventing delivery through what must have been agonizing contractions. The practice, if it occurred as described, would have deprived the infant of oxygen during the most critical moments of the birth process. The transition from womb to world, when the brain is most vulnerable to damage. When Rosemary finally emerged into the gaslit bedroom, she had been oxygen deprived during those crucial hours. The house on Beale Street, a 3-story structure that would later become the John F. Kennedy National Historic Site, preserved as a monument to the family's origins, was already thick with dynastic expectation. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr., Rose's ambitious husband, was building a fortune in banking, shipbuilding, and eventually film production. He wanted not just children, but a dynasty, sons who would reach the White House, daughters who would marry into wealth and prominence, a family name that would echo through American history. Every child born into the Kennedy household arrived with expectations attached, roles already scripted before they could speak. The first signs that something was different about Rosemary emerged slowly in the small developmental markers that parents watch for in infancy and early childhood. She did not sit up on schedule. She did not walk when her older brothers, Joe Jr. and Jack, had walked. Her first words came late, and when they came, they were halting, effortful. Rose Kennedy, a meticulous mother who kept detailed records of her children's development, noted these delays with growing concern. She was not like the others, Rose later confided to relatives and doctors, a phrase that would follow Rosemary through her childhood and into the institutional records that would eventually define her existence. The medical understanding of developmental disabilities in 1918 was primitive by modern standards. Doctors offered vague diagnoses: mental retardation, slowness, backwardness, terms that conveyed little about causation and less about treatment. Some physicians suggested that Rosemary's difficulties stemmed from the traumatic birth. Others attributed them to hereditary factors or simply to bad luck. What remained constant across all these consultations was the expectation, held fiercely by both Rose and Joe Kennedy, that their daughter would somehow catch up, that with enough tutoring, enough discipline, enough effort, she would eventually approximate the Kennedy standard. Family photographs from Brookline and later from the sprawling compound at Hyannisport on Cape Cod show Rosemary included in sailing trips, touch football games, and holiday gatherings. She appears in group portraits alongside her siblings: Joe Jr., Jack, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and eventually Edward, her smile bright, her posture carefully arranged. She was a child both cherished and quietly measured, included in family activities, yet always subtly evaluated against siblings who seemed to move through the world with an ease she could not match. The Kennedys employed tutors and specialists seeking explanations and solutions, but the gap between Rosemary and her brothers and sisters only widened as they grew. Joe Jr. excelled at everything he attempted. Jack, despite chronic illness, devoured books and displayed a quick wit. Kathleen charmed everyone she met. Rosemary tried. Her effort was noted by everyone who worked with her. But trying was never quite enough. Every birthday after 13th of September 1918 quietly renewed a question that no one in the family could answer with certainty. Would Rosemary fit the architecture of ambition that Joe Kennedy Sr. was constructing for his children? Her life had begun with a nurse holding her back for the sake of protocol, waiting for a doctor who prioritized other patients, a gesture that would prove grimly prophetic. Throughout her childhood and into her adult years, Rosemary would be held back, slowed down, contained, and arranged for others' purposes. Her own desires and capabilities subordinated to a family image that could not accommodate difference. By the time Rosemary turned 15 on 13th in September 1933, she had already moved through a succession of schools carefully chosen by her parents to address what they delicately termed her difficulties. The Kennedy children's education was a matter of intense family focus. Joe Sr. believed that intellectual achievement was the foundation of the dynasty he was building, and Rose managed the children's schooling with the same attention to detail she brought to household accounts and social calendars. For the Kennedy sons, this meant elite preparatory schools, Choate for Jack, where he would form friendships that lasted a lifetime, followed by Harvard. For the daughters, it meant Catholic institutions where religious instruction and social polish would prepare them for advantageous marriages. For Rosemary, the educational path was different from the start. At Sacred Heart convent schools in the Northeast, the Providence, Rhode Island Academy, and later the Manhattanville campus in New York, she received special attention from nuns who quickly recognized that she could not keep pace with regular instruction. The Sacred Heart schools served wealthy Catholic families, training their daughters in the graces expected of upper-class women: fluency in French, competence at piano, graceful deportment, and deep religious faith. Rosemary struggled with academics that came easily to her sisters, laboring over reading assignments and arithmetic problems that other girls finished in minutes. She required repetition, patient explanation, and constant encouragement. The nuns tried. By all accounts, they were kind to her, but kindness could not close the gap between Rosemary's capabilities and the curriculum designed for girls of normal intelligence. Eventually, the family acknowledged that mainstream Sacred Heart education was beyond Rosemary's reach. She was enrolled at a boarding school in Pennsylvania, specifically designed for what educators of the era termed intellectually challenged students, or, in the harsher language sometimes used, backward children. The institution offered a modified curriculum, smaller classes, and teachers trained to work with students who learned differently. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, but it also marked Rosemary as separate from her siblings in a way that troubled the family's sense of itself. Kennedys were winners, achievers, the best at whatever they attempted. A Kennedy daughter in a school for slow learners complicated that narrative. Rose Kennedy visited frequently, monitoring Rosemary's progress and communicating constantly with teachers and administrators. Letters and diary entries from the mid 1930s, preserved in family archives and later quoted by biographers, reveal a young woman working with painful diligence to meet expectations she could sense but not quite comprehend. Rosemary's correspondence from this period shows laborious effort on every page. She translated French passages word by word, consulting dictionaries and grammar guides, producing sentences that were technically correct but stilted. She studied European history from the caves onward, as one letter described, memorizing facts and dates that she would recite proudly to her parents. She noted with anticipation the dances and social events that punctuated the school calendar. Occasions when she could dress up, interact with young men, and feel, however briefly, like any other girl her age. One particularly revealing letter from 1934 begins with a salutation that would become a pattern throughout her correspondence. Darling Daddy, j'ai beaucoup travaillé à vous donner plaisir. I have worked very hard to give you pleasure. The French is grammatically correct but simple, the kind of sentence a diligent student might produce after hours of practice. What follows is a detailed account of her studies, her daily routine, and her excitement about an upcoming dance where she hopes to wear a new dress. The handwriting is careful, each letter formed with deliberate attention, the lines remarkably straight across unlined paper. Every page of these letters served as both educational record and emotional ledger, documenting Rosemary's efforts to please parents whose standards she understood she was failing to meet. The context of convent education for upper-class Catholic girls in the 1930s helps illuminate what Rosemary experienced. These institutions sought to produce pious, accomplished, marriageable young women who would be ornaments to their families and credit to their faith. The curriculum balanced religious catechism with language instruction, music lessons, and careful training in deportment: how to walk, how to sit, how to enter a room, how to make conversation without appearing too forward or too reserved. Physical comportment was monitored as closely as academic progress. A Sacred Heart girl was expected to move through the world with graceful restraint, her body disciplined into the postures of feminine refinement. For Rosemary, this curriculum of refinement carried a double burden. She was expected to master the same social graces as her sisters while also undergoing remediation for intellectual deficits that no amount of practice could fully overcome. Her education tilted heavily toward surveillance and correction. Separate classrooms, special tutors, progress reports sent regularly to her parents, conferences about what to do next. The goal was not education in the fullest sense, the cultivation of an independent mind, but management, preparing Rosemary to appear, at least superficially, like any other Kennedy daughter, capable of performing the rituals of upper-class Catholic femininity, even if she could not fully understand them. In her letters, she promised effort and improvement, pleaded for approval, expressed love for parents she desperately wanted to please. In school records and private communications between educators and the Kennedy family, others quietly decided how much effort would ever be enough. The gap between Rosemary's earnest striving and the institution's measured skepticism would only widen as she grew older. On the evening of 11 May 1938, as twilight settled over London's exclusive Belgravia district, the American Embassy residence on Prince's Gate hummed with the particular tension of a household preparing for the most important social ritual of the British season: presentation at court. Rose Kennedy, wife of the newly appointed American ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., was about to present 3 of her daughters, including 19-year-old Rosemary, to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace. The presentation was a ritual with roots stretching back centuries, a ceremony in which young women of distinguished families were formally introduced to the sovereign, signifying their readiness to take their place in society. For an American Catholic family with political ambitions, the opportunity to have daughters curtsying before British royalty was a triumph of social climbing that Joe Kennedy had worked decades to achieve. The preparations had consumed weeks. Dressmakers on Bond Street had created elaborate gowns of white silk and tulle, each requiring multiple fittings to achieve the precise silhouette demanded by court protocol. The rules were exacting: trains of specified length, feathers worn in the hair, long white gloves that buttoned at the wrist. A British press account from the period described Rosemary's ensemble as a picture dress of white tulle embroidered with silver, a confection of fabric and needlework that must have cost more than most English families earned in a year. The dress signified everything a debutante was supposed to represent: purity, refinement, wealth, and readiness for marriage to a suitable man. The diaries that Rosemary kept during the London years, fragments of which have been quoted by biographers, document the intensive training that preceded the court presentation. She attended dress fittings that lasted hours, standing motionless while seamstresses pinned and adjusted. She practiced tea dance etiquette at embassy functions, learning which fork to use, how to make small talk with strangers, when to laugh and when to remain demurely silent. Most demanding of all, she rehearsed the royal curtsy, a deep, controlled dip that required exceptional balance, precise timing, and the kind of physical grace that comes naturally to some women and must be drilled into others. The embassy employed tutors and dance instructors specifically to prepare the Kennedy daughters for their court appearance. The curtsy before the king and queen was no simple bob. It was an athletic feat disguised as feminine submission, requiring the debutante to lower herself almost to the ground while keeping her back straight, her head high, and her train arranged behind her without tangling her feet. One misstep could mean stumbling, falling, or, worst of all, touching the floor with one's hands in an ungainly attempt to recover balance. Such failures were whispered about in society, drawing rooms for years afterward, marking the unfortunate debutante as graceless, poorly trained, unworthy of her place in the ritual. Rosemary practiced for hours in the embassy drawing room, watched by her mother and sisters, corrected and encouraged in turn. Her coordination had always been imperfect, one of the many subtle manifestations of whatever neurological damage she had sustained at birth. The fine motor control required for elegant penmanship or musical performance did not come easily to her. The gross motor control demanded by the court courtesy presented an even greater challenge. She practiced until her legs ached, until her back protested, until she could perform the movement in her sleep, or so she hoped. On the night itself, according to biographers who later interviewed family members and embassy staff, Rosemary was visibly nervous as the Kennedy party waited in the long line of debutantes and their sponsors approaching the throne room. The palace was overwhelming, vast halls lit by thousands of candles and electric chandeliers, footmen in powdered wigs, aristocrats glittering with family jewels. When her moment came, when she stepped forward to face the King and Queen of England and execute the curtsy she had practiced hundreds of times, something went wrong. She lost her balance, wobbled, and nearly fell. The crowd of aristocrats and diplomats assembled in the throne room watched with the studied impassivity that British high society had perfected over centuries. Their Majesties smiled graciously, as if nothing had happened, preserving the fiction of flawless performance that made such rituals possible. Rosemary recovered. She did not actually fall. The moment passed, and the evening continued with receptions and photographs that would appear in society pages on both sides of the Atlantic. But the near fall lingered in family memory as evidence of how close disaster always was, how much effort was required to maintain the appearance of Kennedy perfection. That same London season, family assistants worked to craft Rosemary's public image for American consumption. A statement prepared for the Boston Globe described her serious tastes and her Montessori training, presenting her as a thoughtful, cultured young woman rather than one who struggled with basic academics and physical coordination. The statement was carefully worded to suggest intellectual depth without inviting scrutiny. Rosemary copied this statement out in her own hand, practicing the penmanship, internalizing the self-description others had created for her. The ritual of social refinement now included writing herself into a script authored by others, performing an identity that was not quite her own. In the official photographs from that evening at Buckingham Palace, Rosemary appears flawless, poised, beautiful, every inch the ambassador's daughter. In private family notes and later recollections, the Kennedys were already quietly editing who their eldest daughter was permitted to be, crafting a narrative that could be controlled, presented, and defended against the questions that might otherwise arise. On 12th of March 1939, in the vast expanse of St. Peter's Square in Vatican City, the young Kennedy women stood among tens of thousands of pilgrims, diplomats, and dignitaries gathered to witness one of the Catholic Church's most sacred ceremonies, the coronation mass of Pope Pius V. Eugenio Pacelli, the former Vatican Secretary of State, was being installed as the 260th successor to St. Peter, and the Catholic world had descended on Rome to witness the spectacle. For the Kennedy family, devoutly Catholic despite, or perhaps because of, the discrimination they had faced as Irish Catholics in Protestant Boston, the papal coronation represented a spiritual pinnacle, a moment when their faith and their social ambitions perfectly aligned. Rosemary, now 20 years old, stood among her sisters in the crowd, dressed in the black veil and tailored coat that papal protocol demanded of women in the Pope's presence. Family photograph albums from the European trip, preserved in the Kennedy family collection at the JFK Library, show the Kennedy daughters posed before Roman fountains, ancient ruins, and Baroque churches, their faces bright with the excitement of travel and privilege. The ambassador's daughters were living a life that most American girls could only read about in magazine society pages, papal audiences in the Apostolic Palace, private tours of the Vatican galleries led by monsignors who knew their father, dinners with European aristocrats in palazzos overlooking the Tiber. The diaries that Rose and Rosemary kept during these travels document not merely sightseeing, but an intensive, exhausting curriculum of religious and social etiquette. There were protocols for everything: how to kneel at Mass so that one's skirt draped properly, how to greet cardinals and monsignors with appropriate deference, when to speak and when to remain silent in the presence of senior clergy, how to receive communion with hands folded and eyes downcast. The church had its own elaborate choreography perfected over 2 millennia, and Catholic women of high social standing were expected to perform it flawlessly. The coronation mass itself was a spectacle of sacred theater that overwhelmed the senses. Incense billowed through St. Peter's Basilica, rising in clouds through shafts of golden light that streamed from Bernini's windows. Ancient Latin filled the vast space, chanted by choirs whose voices seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The new pope was carried through the crowds on his sedia gestatoria, the ceremonial throne borne on the shoulders of red-uniformed attendants, while peacock feather fans waved on either side. Bells pealed across Rome. The faithful wept and crossed themselves, and somewhere in that sea of devotion, Rosemary Kennedy watched and tried to understand what it all meant. For a young woman raised in the rituals of American Catholicism, Sunday masses at St. Aidan's in Brookline, May processions with flower crowns, Friday fish dinners, and Saturday confessions, the coronation must have been both spiritually overwhelming and deeply alienating. The scale was beyond anything she had experienced, the theology expressed in ceremonies she could barely follow, yet she was expected to participate with appropriate reverence, to kneel and rise and cross herself at the proper moments, to demonstrate the Catholic devotion that was such an important part of the Kennedy family identity. For a daughter who had already spent her life being told she must try harder, must practice more, must approximate standards she could not quite reach, the elaborate choreography of High Mass became yet another arena of performance and potential failure. Every gesture was observed, every response evaluated. Catholic ritual overlaid social ritual. Both demanded precise movements, controlled emotions, and visible piety. The Kennedy women had to appear not just wealthy and well-bred, but also genuinely devout, their faith as polished as their deportment. After major events, papal audiences, tours of holy sites, formal dinners, Rosemary was encouraged to write orderly accounts in letters home. These letters served multiple purposes. They documented the trip for family members who had remained in the United States. They provided evidence of Rosemary's continued educational progress, and they offered her opportunities to practice the composition and memory skills that her tutors had been trying to develop for years. The letters that survive from this period, examined by biographers, show her striving to capture experiences in language that would please her parents. She described the beauty of the Vatican, the solemnity of the Mass, the kindness of the clergy they met. The effort was visible in every carefully formed sentence, every correctly conjugated verb. Writing was not merely communication, but proof of competence, evidence submitted to a family court that never adjourned. Here, the motif of written words deepens into something more poignant. Throughout Rosemary's life, her handwriting had been a measure of her abilities, a visible record of her limitations. Teachers had noted her laborious penmanship. Parents had saved her letters as proof of progress or lack thereof. In Rome, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of Catholic civilization, Michelangelo's frescoes, Raphael's tapestries, manuscripts illuminated by medieval monks, she practiced forming letters on paper, trying to render her experiences in words that would meet approval. The contrast between the artistic mastery surrounding her and her own humble efforts at composition must have been painfully apparent, at least to her. Publicly, Catholic devotion and diplomatic poise blended seamlessly in the Kennedy daughters' European tour. They appeared in photographs as the ideal products of American Catholic girlhood, beautiful, well-dressed, reverently posed before sacred sites. Privately, the same disciplines of observation and judgment that governed embassy life became another way to measure Rosemary against her siblings. In Rome's candle-lit basilicas, grace was liturgy, sung, performed, offered to God, and witnessed by the faithful. But for one daughter, it was also a standard she feared she could never meet, no matter how fervently she prayed or how carefully she copied words. After the Kennedy family's return to the United States in 1940, as war spread across Europe and Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s ambassadorship ended amid controversy over his isolationist views and defeatist statements about Britain's chances against Nazi Germany, Rosemary found herself enrolled at yet another institution. She was 22 years old now, an age when her sisters were attending debutante balls and her brothers were preparing for military service and political careers. Kathleen, the closest to Rosemary in age and temperament, had returned from London with a broken heart, separated from the young British aristocrat she loved by an ocean and a war. Eunice was finishing college. Patricia and Jean were still in school. The Kennedy sons were charting courses toward the heroism and tragedy that would define their generation. Joe Jr. toward a doom bombing mission over England, Jack toward the PT-109 and the legend that would carry him to the White House. Rosemary's path led to a convent school in Washington, D.C., chosen specifically for its strict discipline and close moral supervision. The institution, identified in some sources as a facility run by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, an order known for working with wayward girls and women, offered the kind of structure that Rose Kennedy believed her eldest daughter needed. The daily routine resembled that of many elite Catholic girls' schools of the era: early morning mass in the chapel, supervised study periods in high-ceilinged classrooms, monitored walks through manicured grounds, evening prayers before bed. The schedule was designed to leave no unsupervised moments, no opportunities for idleness or mischief. For Rosemary, the constraints were notably stricter than for other students. She received separate instruction from the nuns, her lessons simplified and repeated until she showed mastery. She faced closer observation during meals, recreation, and free periods. Staff members were instructed to report any unusual behavior to the Mother Superior, who in turn communicated regularly with Rose Kennedy. Every aspect of Rosemary's life was monitored, documented, and evaluated, a continuation of the surveillance that had characterized her education since childhood, now intensified as her family's anxiety about her behavior grew. Letters from these years continue the patterns established in her adolescence, beginning with the familiar salutation, "Darling Daddy," and assuring Joe Sr. of her efforts, her affection, her desire to please. "I am so fond of you," she wrote in one letter preserved by family archivists and later quoted in biographies. "I have worked hard, and I hope you are proud of me." The language is simple, earnest, almost childlike in its need for approval, remarkable for a woman in her early 20s, but consistent with Rosemary's developmental level and with the dynamics of the Kennedy family, in which Joe Sr.'s approval was the ultimate measure of worth. Yet other records from this period, recollections gathered decades later from cousins, former schoolmates, and the nuns who supervised her, describe behavior that alarmed the convent staff and terrified Rosemary's parents. She had begun sneaking out at night, escaping the dormitory through windows or back doors and walking the streets of Washington alone. Sometimes she visited bars where her beauty and charm attracted attention from men who knew nothing of her background or her limitations. She was seen in the company of strangers, talking and laughing in ways that would have been unremarkable for a typical young woman, but that, for Rosemary, suggested vulnerability to exploitation and danger. The fears were specific to the era and to the Kennedy family's social position. An unmarried woman of 22, wandering unsupervised at night in a major city, risked encounters that could lead to pregnancy, venereal disease, or scandal. In 1940s America, such outcomes would have been devastating for any respectable family. For the Kennedys, with their political ambitions and carefully cultivated public image, they were unthinkable. Joe Sr. had spent decades building a fortune and a reputation. He was positioning his sons for national leadership. A daughter who might become pregnant by an unknown man, who might contract a disease, who might be photographed in compromising circumstances, or arrested for erratic behavior. Such a daughter threatened everything he had worked to achieve. The convent nuns did their best to contain the situation. They increased surveillance, locked doors and windows, assigned staff to watch Rosemary during the night, but she continued to escape, driven by impulses that neither she nor her caregivers fully understood. Was it rebellion against years of constraint, a manifestation of intellectual disability that impaired her judgment about risk? Emerging mental illness that had nothing to do with her birth injury? The historical record does not provide clear answers, and the medical understanding of the era was too primitive to offer reliable diagnosis. What is documented is the family's response, growing alarm that hardened into determination to find a solution. Rose Kennedy, ever the devout Catholic, may have hoped that prayer and discipline would eventually calm her daughter. Joe Kennedy, the pragmatist and strategist, began looking for more definitive interventions. The rituals of Catholic schooling had promised safety and virtue, structured days, supervised activities, the guidance of religious women who had dedicated their lives to God's service. For Rosemary, those rituals had become walls closing in, constraints that provoked escape rather than compliance. Her letters said, "I am so fond of you." The school's phone calls to Hyannis Port said she had gone missing again. By late 1940, shortly after Rosemary's 22nd birthday on 13th of September, the private conversations about her within the Kennedy family took on an increasingly clinical tone. According to accounts later provided by Eunice Kennedy Shriver and other family members, Rosemary had become increasingly irritable and difficult, prone to mood swings that could escalate into violent outbursts. The young woman who had once curtsied before the King and Queen of England now sometimes threw objects, screamed at caregivers, struck out at siblings and staff. These episodes frightened everyone who witnessed them, not least Rosemary herself, who seemed unable to control or understand the rages that overtook her. Whether these behaviors represented a genuine change in her neurological or psychiatric condition, a response to the mounting pressures and frustrations of her life, hormonal changes associated with her age, or some combination of factors remains debated by historians and medical commentators. Some biographers have suggested that Rosemary may have been experiencing the onset of mental illness, perhaps bipolar disorder or another mood disorder, that was distinct from her intellectual disability. Others have proposed that years of constant surveillance, failed expectations, and frustrated desires had produced an emotional crisis that expressed itself in violence. What is documented is the family's growing alarm and their determination to find a solution. The previous years had produced a trail of institutional frustration. Summer camps had expelled her for behavioral problems. Short-lived placements at boarding schools in Massachusetts and Philadelphia had ended when staff reported they could not manage her. Each new setting had promised structure and improvement. Each had eventually conceded defeat. The pattern exhausted everyone involved: teachers, nuns, administrators, and most of all, Rosemary herself, shuttled from place to place like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. Her difficulties were named and renamed by each new set of experts, described in the evolving vocabulary of psychology and education, yet no one seemed able to help her. In the wider medical world of 1940, new psychiatric techniques were being promoted as modern scientific solutions for troubled minds. The prefrontal lobotomy, a surgical procedure that severed connections in the brain's frontal lobes, had been developed by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz in 1935 and rapidly adapted for American practice by neurologist Walter Freeman and neurosurgeon James Watts. Moniz would receive the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949 for this work, a recognition that reflected the medical establishment's embrace of psychosurgery as a legitimate treatment for mental illness. Freeman, in particular, was an enthusiastic evangelist for the procedure. He traveled the country demonstrating his technique, published articles in professional journals and popular magazines, and presented lobotomy as a breakthrough that could calm agitation, end violent outbursts, and restore domestic tranquility to families burdened by mentally ill relatives. The surgery was quick. Freeman would eventually develop a transorbital technique that could be performed in minutes using an ice pick-like instrument inserted through the eye socket, and the results, he claimed, were dramatic. Patients who had been uncontrollable became docile. Families who had despaired found relief. The reality, as later decades would reveal, was far more complicated. Lobotomy did not cure mental illness. It destroyed parts of the brain responsible for personality, emotion, and complex thought. Patients who survived the procedure often became passive, flat, unable to plan or initiate activity, emotionally blunted. Some experienced seizures, incontinence, or further cognitive decline. Some died from surgical complications. But in 1940, these outcomes were not widely understood or reported. The medical mainstream accepted lobotomy as a useful treatment, and desperate families accepted the promises of doctors who presented themselves as experts. For Joe Kennedy Sr., who had tied his family's future to political ambition and social prestige, the convergence of medical promise and social anxiety proved fatefully compelling. His daughter's behavior threatened everything he had built. Her nighttime wanderings could lead to scandal. Her violent outbursts could result in injury or public embarrassment. Her very existence as a Kennedy who did not fit the Kennedy mold complicated the narrative of family excellence he was constructing. The daughter whose letters begged, "Darling Daddy, I hate to disappoint you in any way," was now the subject of urgent conversations about risk management, about how to contain the threat she posed to her brother's futures. In specialist offices around Boston and Washington, her moods were charted, her behaviors cataloged, her case discussed by men who had never met the girl who wrote French sentences to please her father. In family strategy sessions, the kind of meetings where Joe Sr. planned business deals and political campaigns, her future was quietly being rewritten without her knowledge or consent. The same calculation that guided his investment decisions and his political maneuvering now focused on his eldest daughter. What could be done to minimize risk and protect the family's position? The answer emerging from medical consultations was surgery, brain surgery, a lobotomy that would, doctors promised, smooth her moods and end the behaviors that threatened Kennedy ambitions. In the middle months of 1941, in medical offices in Washington, D.C. and Boston, Joseph Kennedy Sr. met repeatedly with the doctors who had pioneered the American practice of lobotomy. Walter Freeman and James Watts represented the cutting edge of psychiatric medicine, or so they presented themselves. Their published papers described successful outcomes in patients who had been violent, uncontrollable, or profoundly disturbed before surgery. Their consultations with Joe Kennedy focused on whether Rosemary was an appropriate candidate for the procedure and what outcomes could be expected. Freeman and Watts assured the anxious father that a lobotomy could transform his daughter's life. The surgery would smooth her moods, end her violent episodes, and, crucially, eliminate the impulsive behaviors that led her to sneak out at night and wander the streets. She would become calm, manageable, content with a quiet life under proper supervision. The procedure was relatively new, but gaining acceptance. Freeman had performed dozens of lobotomies on patients with various diagnoses, and he reported favorable outcomes in most cases. The medical establishment, or at least its more progressive wing, endorsed psychosurgery as state-of-the-art treatment. Biographer Ronald Kessler and other historians who later investigated the Kennedy family have documented Joe's particular concerns during these consultations. He was not primarily worried about Rosemary's happiness or well-being, though he may have convinced himself that he was acting in her interest. His overriding concern was the family's political future and public image. Joe Jr., his eldest son and greatest hope, was being groomed for a presidential run. The boy had everything: looks, intelligence, charisma, ambition, and his father had already mapped out a path to the White House. Jack, despite chronic health problems that would have disqualified most men from public life, was also destined for politics. He had the wit and charm to win voters even if his body was failing. A daughter who wandered the streets at night, who might become pregnant by an unknown man, who might be photographed in compromising circumstances or arrested for erratic behavior, such a daughter posed an unacceptable threat to these carefully laid plans. The calculus was brutal, but, to Joe Kennedy, clear. The reputation of the family, the futures of his sons, the dynasty he had spent his life building. All of these were more important than one daughter's autonomy or well-being. If surgery could solve the problem Rosemary represented, then surgery it would be. The medical records of Freeman and Watts from this period do not single out Rosemary for special social consideration. In their case files, she was one patient among many treated for what they broadly termed mental disorder or behavioral disturbance. But in the Kennedy household, she was uniquely entangled with the family brand. Her behavior was not merely a personal or medical problem. It was a strategic liability. Where earlier generations of wealthy fathers had arranged marriages to secure business alliances and protect family reputations, Joe Kennedy weighed a surgical intervention that promised to secure public perception by fundamentally altering his daughter's brain. Rose Kennedy's own diaries from this period, later examined by historians and biographers seeking to understand how the family reached such a devastating decision, show no evidence that she knew about the specific surgical plans being discussed. Whether Joe deliberately kept her ignorant, or whether she suspected but chose not to ask, the historical record does not clearly reveal. What is documented is the silence between her diary entries, the conversations not recorded, the consultations she did not attend, the decisions made without her input. She continued to manage the Kennedy household, organize charity events, supervise the younger children's education, and fulfill the social obligations of a prominent Catholic matron. If she knew that her husband was consulting with brain surgeons about their eldest daughter, she left no written evidence of that knowledge. The silence in the archives, the things not discussed, the questions not asked, the records not kept, becomes one of the most telling features of this period. A mother organizing charity balls and reviewing children's report cards while decisions about her daughter's brain were being made elsewhere, perhaps in her husband's study, certainly without her meaningful involvement. Whether Rose was deliberately excluded or simply not consulted may matter less than the result. When Joe Kennedy decided to proceed with the lobotomy, he did so without his wife's informed consent. In the doctor's notes, Rosemary was a case to be treated, her symptoms cataloged, her prognosis debated, her surgery scheduled. In her father's calculations, she had become a variable in a complex equation, a risk to be managed, a problem to be solved. The daughter who had once written, "Darling Daddy, j'ai beaucoup travaillé à vous donner plaisir," had been reduced to a calculus of family interest. In November 1941, 2 months after Rosemary's 23rd birthday, she was taken to George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C., where doctors Walter Freeman and James Watts performed a prefrontal lobotomy. The surgery took place in an operating room that would have looked unremarkable: white walls, surgical lights, metal instruments arranged on trays. But what happened there would destroy a young woman's life and haunt her family for generations. The procedure was conducted with Rosemary conscious, as was standard practice for psychosurgery at the time. General anesthesia was considered too risky. Instead, patients received local anesthetic to numb the scalp and skull while remaining awake and responsive throughout the operation. This allowed the surgeons to monitor the effects of their cutting in real time, adjusting their approach based on the patient's responses. Watts later described his technique in medical papers and interviews. He would ask patients to recite poems, sing songs, count backward, or answer simple questions during the procedure. As the surgeon's instrument severed connections in the frontal lobes, the patient's responses would change, becoming slower, more confused, less coherent. When speech deteriorated to a certain point, the surgeons knew they had cut far enough. Accounts specific to Rosemary's operation, gathered from Watts's later recollections and from family members who eventually learned the details, indicate that the procedure went catastrophically wrong. Some versions suggest that Freeman, known for his aggressive approach, pushed for deeper cuts than Watts thought prudent. Others indicate that the damage was simply more severe than anyone anticipated. What is documented is the outcome. By the time the surgeons stopped cutting, Rosemary's speech had become completely incoherent. She could no longer form words, no longer respond to questions, no longer demonstrate the consciousness that had made her, despite her limitations, a thinking and feeling person. The transformation was immediate and devastating. When she emerged from the hospital, Rosemary Kennedy was no longer the young woman who had practiced curtsies in embassy drawing rooms, who had written letters in labored French to please. Her father, who had sneaked out of convents in search of experiences that her family had denied her. Her cognitive capacity had been reduced to that of a toddler. She could not walk without assistance. The coordination that had allowed her to almost complete a court curtsy was gone forever. She spoke only a few words, and those with difficulty. She was incontinent, unable to control basic bodily functions. The personality that had charmed London hostesses and alarmed Washington nuns, that complex mixture of sweetness, frustration, determination, and emerging rebellion, had been surgically erased. Technically, Freeman and Watts had followed the emerging protocol of psychosurgery, a protocol that was crude by any modern standard, but accepted by the medical mainstream of 1941. They had not committed malpractice by the standards of their time. They had performed a procedure that was considered legitimate treatment for mental and behavioral disorders. But the human reality of what they had done transcended medical categories. They had taken a young woman who, despite her intellectual limitations, had been capable of love, effort, hope, and desire, and reduced her to a shell, a body that required constant care and could contribute nothing to her own existence. Joe Kennedy informed his wife only after the surgery was complete, presenting her with a fait accompli that she could neither undo nor apparently fully comprehend. Rose's reaction is not recorded in any surviving document, another silence in an archive that is full of strategic omissions. Did she rage at her husband? Weep for her daughter? Accept his decision with the submission expected of Catholic wives in that era? The historical record provides no answers. What is documented is what happened next. Rosemary was removed from the family's daily life, placed in institutions where she would spend the next 6 decades, her existence concealed from the public and minimized even within the Kennedy family. The daughter who had once been trained to perform a perfect curtsy before royalty was now lifted and moved by nurses, changed like an infant, fed by caregivers because she could not reliably feed herself. The daughter who had written, "Darling Daddy, I hate to disappoint you in any way," could no longer form letters on a page, could no longer understand the words she had once labored so hard to produce. A procedure sold to her father as a way to improve domestic tranquility and protect the family's reputation. had instead permanently erased his daughter's agency, her personality, her capacity for the effort and love that had defined her letters home. It was an extreme form of control masquerading as medical care, and it was irreversible. In 1 year, the hand that had carefully copied French phrases to please her father could no longer reliably hold a pen. The woman who had nearly fallen before the King and Queen of England would never stand on her own again. On 6 May 1944, in the functional surroundings of Chelsea Town Hall in London, churches having been ruled out by religious differences that neither family could fully accept, Kathleen Kick Kennedy married William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire, and one of the wealthiest estates in the British Isles. Wedding photographs preserved in the Kennedy family collection show a radiant young couple flanked by those who could attend in wartime. Joe Kennedy Jr., in his naval aviator's uniform, just weeks away from the volunteer mission that would kill him. A scattering of British aristocrats who had defied convention to attend a ceremony the Catholic Church refused to sanction. Friends from Kick's London debutante days who remembered the charming American girl who had captured everyone's heart. The match represented the culmination of everything the Kennedy daughters had been trained for. The apotheosis of the transatlantic marriage market that had shaped elite society since the Gilded Age. For generations, American heiresses had crossed the Atlantic to marry impoverished British aristocrats, exchanging New World dollars for Old World titles in transactions that enriched both parties. The Kennedys were not aristocrats, but their wealth and ambition placed them in the same social orbit. Kick had fallen genuinely in love with Billy Hartington during the London season of 1938, the same season when Rosemary had nearly fallen before the King and Queen, and the war had only intensified their bond. The marriage was controversial on both sides. Rose Kennedy disapproved strenuously of her daughter marrying outside the Catholic faith, and she refused to attend the wedding. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire had their own reservations about their heir marrying an American Catholic whose father had publicly predicted Britain's defeat. But the young couple were determined, and in the chaos of wartime, when death seemed possible at any moment, such objections faded in importance. Kick renounced her right to raise children Catholic, a concession that devastated her mother, and the wedding proceeded with a reduced guest list and simplified ceremony. Yet the marriage still elevated the Kennedy name to new heights of social prestige. A Kennedy daughter was now a future duchess, potential mistress of Chatsworth House and its thousands of acres, connected by marriage to one of England's oldest and most distinguished families. The newspapers covered the wedding extensively, speculating about the children who might someday inherit both Kennedy ambition and Cavendish tradition. It was a fairy tale, of sorts, the kind of outcome that justified all those years of etiquette lessons, finishing schools, and practicing curtsies. On this May day in London, as her sisters spoke wedding vows and posed for photographs, Rosemary Kennedy was not present. She was not a bridesmaid, not a guest, not even a topic of conversation among the wedding party. By 1944, she had been institutionalized for nearly 3 years, first at Craig House, a private psychiatric facility in Beacon, New York, known for treating wealthy patients with mental and emotional problems, and later at other institutions as the family sought to manage her care while keeping her existence as quiet as possible. The lobotomy had reduced her to a state requiring constant supervision. She could not have traveled to London even if she had been invited, could not have understood the ceremony or remembered the sister she had once practiced curtsies alongside. She had been effectively erased from the family's public narrative. Journalists who asked about the Kennedy children were told that Rosemary was teaching somewhere or living quietly in the Midwest. No photographs of her appeared in the press. No mention was made of her condition or whereabouts. The family that had once presented her at court, that had prepared careful statements about her serious tastes for newspaper consumption, now pretended she barely existed. She had become a secret, a silence, an absence in wedding albums and family portraits. The contrast between the two sisters could not be starker. On one page of the Kennedy family story, Kick gains a title, becomes the Marchioness of Hartington. takes her place among the British aristocracy her parents had long admired. On another page, unwritten, unacknowledged, deliberately hidden, Rosemary exists only in institutional correspondence and medical records, her condition described in clinical terminology to administrators and nurses who had never met the rest of her family. Marriage operated in this story as it always had in elite society, as architecture of power, binding families and consolidating influence across continents and generations. Rosemary, who had once trained alongside her sisters in all the arts of social performance, had been silently removed from that blueprint. Her name did not appear in wedding announcements. Her face did not appear in photographs. Her existence did not appear in the narrative of the Kennedy triumph that the family was carefully constructing. In the wedding album, one daughter advanced the family's ambitions dramatically, another had been surgically silenced and institutionally hidden, reduced to a line in records that no one outside the family would see for decades. On 2nd November 1958, as John Fitzgerald Kennedy stood for re-election to the United States Senate in Massachusetts, a race he would win by the largest margin in state history, positioning himself for the presidential campaign he would launch less than 2 years later. Campaign literature and press coverage featured carefully curated photographs of the vigorous, attractive Kennedy clan. The images told a story of American success. Handsome Jack and glamorous Jackie, brothers and sisters gathered at Hyannisport, parents beaming with pride at children who seemed destined for greatness. It was a portrait of family unity, Catholic, achievement, and democratic promise that would carry Jack Kennedy all the way to the White House. Rosemary was absent from these photographs, as she had been absent from Kennedy public life since 1941, when journalists occasionally asked about the ambassador's eldest daughter. And some did. Their curiosity piqued by her disappearance from family events, they received careful, evasive answers. She was teaching at a school in the Midwest. She was doing charitable work. She preferred a quiet life away from the spotlight. The explanations were vague enough to discourage further inquiry while suggesting that Rosemary was simply a private person who had chosen a different path than her ambitious siblings. Within the Kennedy family, a careful vocabulary had developed for discussing, or not discussing, Rosemary's condition. Internal narratives, later recounted by Eunice's son Timothy Shriver and other family members who eventually spoke publicly about their aunt, reveal that Joe Sr. and Rose had made a deliberate decision about terminology. They chose to describe Rosemary as mentally retarded rather than mentally ill. The distinction was strategic and reflected the social codes of 1950s America. Intellectual disability, while stigmatized, was understood as a fixed condition, something a person was born with, not something that reflected on the family's mental health or genetic fitness. Families with disabled children were objects of sympathy, not suspicion. Mental illness, by contrast, carried far deeper stigma. It suggested hereditary weakness, moral failure, or the kind of instability that voters might fear in a presidential candidate. If John Kennedy's sister was mentally ill, opponents might whisper that madness ran in the family, that Jack himself might crack under pressure, that the Kennedy genes were tainted. If she was simply mentally retarded, she could be framed as a tragic figure whose condition was nobody's fault, certainly not evidence of anything wrong with her ambitious brothers. The family never mentioned the lobotomy. That surgical violence remained the deepest secret, known only to a handful of people within the Kennedy inner circle. The operation that had transformed Rosemary from a struggling but functional young woman into someone requiring constant institutional care was simply erased from the family narrative. When asked about her condition, family members implied that she had always been this way, that her retardation dated from birth, not from a November day in 1941 when surgeons had cut into her brain at her father's instruction. Meanwhile, at St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, Rosemary lived in a private world designed to keep her comfortable while keeping her hidden. The facility, operated by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi since 1904, cared for hundreds of disabled children and adults on its sprawling campus in rural Wisconsin. For most residents, this meant dormitory, living, and shared activities. For Rosemary Kennedy, it meant something different, a custom-built cottage about a mile from the main campus, staffed by dedicated nuns and caregivers, equipped with everything she might need but isolated from the institution's general population. The Kennedy cottage was a comfortable arrangement by institutional standards. Rosemary had her own bedroom, a living area, access to a car for short drives through the Wisconsin countryside. Nuns who knew her routines and understood her needs supervised her daily life: meals, walks, simple crafts, Mass in a nearby chapel. It was a far cry from Craig House and the psychiatric facilities where she had spent the first years after her lobotomy, and the family paid handsomely to maintain her there. But the cottage was also a buffer, a way to keep her physically separated from other residents and from any visitors who might recognize the Kennedy name or ask uncomfortable questions. As her brothers ascended to national prominence, Jack to the Senate and then the presidency, Bobby to the Justice Department, Ted to his own Senate seat in Massachusetts, the family's public narrative became ever more carefully controlled. Speechwriters crafted stories of Kennedy courage, Kennedy service, Kennedy sacrifice. Joe Jr. had died a hero's death in World War II. Jack had survived his PT boat sinking through sheer grit. The family had overcome religious prejudice and social snobbery to reach the highest levels of American power. It was an inspiring narrative, and much of it was true. But one sibling's sacrifice, the daughter whose brain had been surgically altered to protect the family image, whose existence had been hidden for 2 decades, whose letters to "Darling Daddy" now lay in archives no one consulted, could not be publicly named or acknowledged. That truth would remain hidden for years to come. By 1962, a full year into John F. Kennedy's presidency, the wall of silence that the family had built around Rosemary began, slowly, tentatively, partially, to crack. That year, Eunice Kennedy Shriver published an article in the Saturday Evening Post, one of America's most widely read magazines, that discussed for the first time in a major national publication her mentally retarded sister. The article was groundbreaking not for what it revealed. It said nothing about the lobotomy, nothing about the surgery that had transformed Rosemary's mild intellectual disability into profound incapacity. But for the simple fact of acknowledgement, Kennedy was admitting, publicly, that the family included a disabled member. The article argued passionately for better opportunities, better education, and better treatment for people with intellectual disabilities. Eunice described visiting institutions where disabled children and adults were warehoused in grim conditions, denied education, denied therapy, denied the basic dignity of human attention. She called for research into the causes of intellectual disability, for training programs that would help disabled people develop their capabilities, for social acceptance that would allow them to participate in community life. It was a manifesto for change, written by a woman whose social position gave her words unusual weight. The piece marked the beginning of Eunice Kennedy Shriver's lifelong transformation from political sister to disability advocate. She had visited Rosemary at St. Coletta's many times over the years, had witnessed firsthand the isolation, the limited expectations, the institutional routines that defined her sister's existence. She had seen Rosemary sitting in her cottage, surrounded by nuns who cared for her physical needs but could not restore the personality and capability that had been surgically removed. She had also observed how other disabled individuals were treated in American society, hidden away by ashamed families, warehoused in state institutions, denied education and opportunity, treated as less than fully human. The experience radicalized Eunice in ways that her brothers' political careers never quite matched. Jack was pursuing civil rights and Cold War strategy. Bobby was chasing organized crime and, later, his own political ambitions. Ted was learning the mechanics of Senate power. Eunice channeled the family's resources, connections, and influence into a different kind of crusade, one that would ultimately affect millions of lives around the world. In July 1968, a month of national trauma, coming just weeks after Bobby Kennedy's assassination in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen, Eunice founded the first Special Olympics at a summer camp in Maryland. She had been working toward this moment for years, organizing day camps for disabled children at her home in Maryland, studying what activities in sports could be adapted for participants with cognitive impairments. The 1968 Games brought together approximately 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities for competition in track and field, swimming, floor hockey, and other events. It was, by the standards of the time, an extraordinary gathering. Disabled people competing in athletic events, cheered by crowds, awarded medals, treated as athletes rather than patients. The Special Olympics grew from that Maryland summer camp into a global movement. By the time of Eunice's death in 2009, the organization would serve millions of athletes in nearly 200 countries, offering year-round training and competition in dozens of sports. It had changed how the world thought about intellectual disability, demonstrating that people once considered incapable of achievement could train, compete, and excel. The Special Olympics had become one of the most significant disability rights initiatives in history, and it had begun, at least in part, in one woman's grief and guilt over what had happened to her sister. Within the family, the late 1960s and 1970s brought a gradual, imperfect reconnection with Rosemary. More siblings began visiting her at St. Coletta's, taking her on trips to the family compound in Hyannisport, to Florida for winter vacations, to restaurants and parks where she could experience something of the world outside institutional walls. These visits were not always easy. Rosemary's condition had not improved with time. She remained profoundly disabled, requiring assistance with most daily activities, capable of only limited communication. But she was still their sister, still a Kennedy, and as the family's public narrative began slowly to acknowledge her existence, private contact increased as well. The woman who had once written, "Darling Daddy, I hate to disappoint you in any way," now inspired programs designed so that others would not be defined solely by their limitations. She could not understand the Special Olympics, could not comprehend the policy changes her sister advocated, and could not read the articles written about her own case. But her existence and her suffering had become a catalyst for transformation. Political capital that had once demanded her silence, that had funded her hidden institutional life, now generated organizations and initiatives in her name. It was an indirect, imperfect acknowledgement of what had been taken from her. Not justice, exactly, but something. Her signature could no longer form on a page, but her absence from normal life had helped shape a global movement. In 1949, after several years at Craig House and other psychiatric facilities where the family had struggled to find appropriate care for her post-lobotomy condition, Rosemary was moved permanently to St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She would live there for more than 5 decades, longer than she had lived anywhere else, longer than the combined years of her childhood in Brookline, her troubled adolescence in convent schools, her brief seasons of debutante glory in London and Rome. The institution would become her world, the nuns her family, the cottage her only home. The Kennedy Cottage, built specifically for Rosemary about a mile from St. Coletta's main campus, reflected the family's wealth and their desire to provide for their daughter while keeping her separate from the institution's general population. It was a modest but comfortable house, designed for accessibility, ramps instead of stairs, wide doorways that could accommodate wheelchairs or walkers, a layout that allowed caregivers to supervise her easily. A chapel stood nearby, where she could attend the daily mass that had been part of her life since childhood. A car was available for short drives through the Wisconsin countryside, trips to nearby towns, to restaurants where the staff knew her, to parks where she could walk with assistants and watch other people living the ordinary lives that had been denied to her. 2 nuns, Sister Margaret Ann and Sister Leona, appear repeatedly in institutional records and later accounts as Rosemary's primary caregivers during her decades at St. Coletta's. They learned her routines and preferences, her moods and needs, the way she liked her hair arranged, the foods she would eat willingly and those she would refuse, the activities that calmed her and those that agitated her. They managed her daily care, bathing, dressing, feeding, with the patience that religious vocation and professional training had instilled. They became, in effect, her family, more present in her daily life than the siblings and parents who visited occasionally and left again. Daily life at the cottage followed predictable patterns designed to provide structure and comfort. Mornings began with personal care and breakfast, followed by simple activities, crafts that exercised her remaining manual dexterity, walks on the grounds when weather permitted, time in the small garden that had been planted for her enjoyment. Mass was a daily constant, connecting her to the Catholic rituals that had shaped her entire life, even if she could no longer understand the theology that underlay them. Afternoons might include outings in the car, visits to the main campus for special events, or simply quiet time in the living room with the nuns who knew her best. The routine was gentle, protective, designed to minimize stress and maximize whatever contentment was possible for a woman whose capacity for experience had been so drastically reduced. It was a far cry from the opera boxes of Covent Garden, the embassy drawing rooms of Prince's Gate, the papal audiences in Vatican City. The young woman who had once practiced curtsies for royal presentations now struggled to walk unassisted. The young woman who had written letters in careful French to please her father could no longer reliably hold a pen. The gap between what her life had been and what it had become measured the full cost of that November day in 1941. Family photographs from the 1970s and 1980s taken during visits to Hyannisport and other Kennedy gatherings show Rosemary among her siblings and their growing families. Her smile in these images is uneven, her posture different from the carefully trained carriage of her youth, her eyes not quite meeting the camera in the way her sister's eyes do. But she is present, included, surrounded by brothers and sisters, and nieces and nephews who lean toward her with what appears to be genuine affection. The visits increased as the years passed, and the family's relationship with its hidden members slowly evolved. Yet the archival record also documents painful absences and enduring estrangements. Rose Kennedy, Rosemary's mother, did not visit her daughter for 20 years after the lobotomy. The reasons for this long absence remain subject to historical speculation. Was it guilt over a decision she had not been consulted about, grief too profound to confront directly, denial that allowed her to continue functioning as Kennedy matriarch, religious fatalism that interpreted Rosemary's fate as God's will, not to be questioned? Rose never explained publicly, and her private papers offer no clear answers. Joe Kennedy Sr., who had authorized the operation without his wife's knowledge, never visited Rosemary at St. Coletta's at all. He suffered a debilitating stroke in December 1961, just months into his son's presidency, that left him largely unable to speak or move independently. He lived 8 more years in this diminished state, dying in November 1969 without ever seeing the daughter whose destruction he had ordered. The irony of his condition, the powerful patriarch reduced to helpless dependency, requiring the same kind of constant care that his surgical violence had imposed on Rosemary, was noted by biographers, but apparently not by Joe himself, who remained uncommunicative until his death. The motif of letters that had run through Rosemary's life now reversed direction. Where young Rosemary had once written in careful French, "J'ai beaucoup travaillé à vous donner plaisir," the later years of her life produced a different kind of documentation: books, articles, and policy papers written about her, using her story as case study, cautionary tale, and catalyst for change. On 7 January 2005, at Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, a few miles from the St. Coletta campus where she had lived for 56 years, Rosemary Kennedy died of natural causes at the age of 86. Several of her surviving siblings were at her bedside in her final hours, a family presence that had been sporadic in the decades after her lobotomy, but had grown more consistent as the old secrets surfaced and the family's relationship with its hidden member slowly transformed. She had outlived her parents, outlived most of her brothers, outlived the era that had made her destruction possible, and the silence that had concealed it. She was buried at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, the same Boston suburb where she had been born on that difficult September night in 1918. Her grave lies not far from the house on Beale Street, where a nurse had held her back for an absent doctor, beginning the chain of oxygen deprivation, developmental delay, frustrated expectations, and ultimately surgical violence that defined her life. The Kennedy family plot at Holyhood holds many of the clan's dead: Joe and Rose, Joe Jr. and Kick, later Ted and others. Rosemary rests among them now, in death accorded the family membership that her living years had so often denied. By the time of her death, the full story of Rosemary Kennedy's life had entered public knowledge, transforming her from family secret to historical figure. Biographer Kate Clifford Larson's meticulously researched book, Rosemary, The Hidden Kennedy Daughter, published in 2015, drew on family papers, medical records, institutional archives, and interviews with surviving relatives and caregivers to document what had long been whispered but never officially confirmed. The lobotomy, the secrecy, the decades of institutional concealment. Earlier works by historians and Kennedy chroniclers, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Lawrence Leamer, Ronald Kessler, and others, had pieced together fragments of the story over the years, gradually building a picture that the family could no longer entirely control. The woman who had been deliberately hidden, whose existence had been folded into euphemism and strategic omission for more than half a century, now had a place in the historical record that went far beyond her role as the retarded Kennedy sister. Scholars and journalists examined her story for what it revealed about disability, gender, family power, medical ethics, and the dark underside of American ambition. Her case became a touchstone for discussions of informed consent, patient rights, and the dangers of psychiatric treatments imposed without adequate understanding of their consequences. Museum exhibits at the John F. Kennedy National Historic Site in Brookline, the preserved house on Beale Street where Rosemary was born, now include her photographs and a far more candid narrative of her life than the family would once have permitted. Visitors walking through the modest rooms where the Kennedy dynasty began can see images from the London Embassy years. Rosemary at tea dances, in her debutante gown, posed with her sisters before their presentation at court. They can also read about the lobotomy and its aftermath, about the decades at St. Coletta's, about the disability rights movement that her suffering helped to inspire. The display cases hold reproductions of diary pages and letters, those documents beginning "Darling Daddy" that trace a young woman's desperate effort to please a family whose standards she could never meet, the handwriting that once tried so hard to conform, the careful French, the neat penmanship, the laboriously composed sentences, now asks a different question of viewers who pause before these artifacts. What did refinement cost, and who bore that cost most silently? The social architecture that once demanded Rosemary's perfection, the embassy drawing rooms where she practiced curtsies, the convent classrooms where she struggled with arithmetic, the medical offices where her father decided her fate, now frames her story as a moral lesson about disability, consent, and the dangerous intersection of medical authority and family ambition. It is a transformation that acknowledges tragedy without fully undoing it, that offers understanding without providing redemption. Rosemary Kennedy cannot be restored to the life she might have led, cannot be compensated for the 64 years she spent in institutional care, cannot be given back the words and movements and desires that surgery stole from her. The lobotomy remains a wound that no amount of historical attention can heal. But her story, told fully at last, serves as testimony and warning. Testimony to what was done in the name of family, reputation, and social conformity, warning against the assumption that medical authority and parental power can ever justify such violations of human autonomy. The gloves she wore on that May evening in 1938, when she stood in the embassy drawing room, preparing to curtsy before the King and Queen of England, remain preserved in archival tissue paper. Artifacts from a lost world of debutante rituals and transatlantic ambition. The hands that wore them, that once copied French sentences and adjusted white satin sashes, never wrote freely again. In one photograph from that evening, Rosemary stands in her elaborate gown, her posture perfect, her smile practiced, ready to perform the role that others had scripted for her. In another photograph, taken decades later at St. Coletta's, she sits in a simple room, her hair gray now, her eyes still holding something of the young woman she had once been. Between those two images lies an entire life, constrained, silenced, hidden, and finally, too late, acknowledged. The most powerful Kennedy daughter, in the end, may be the one whose curtailed life quietly reshaped how the world thinks about disability and care.